As Glenn said, my name's Ryan Pennesi. I'm a professional nature photographer. I live up the North Shore in Finland. It's an awesome backyard to have, great playground, and it's where I've really dove in really deep into photography and have a deep respect for nature and wildlife. As a kid, I grew up in Massachusetts on the East Coast, and I was that kid that was always falling into vernal pools trying to catch frogs. And looking for yellow spotted salamanders during their migration. In college, I got to play with trail cameras, and we found this spot where a deer had been killed by some coyotes, and we put a camera on it, and I could not believe how many different critters showed up to take advantage of that energy source and redistribute it throughout the woods. So it really got me hooked on photography, and I really started diving deep after that. So I grew up on the East Coast, and then I came out here to Minnesota in 2013, and I actually met Dylan, who's back there, at a place called Wolf Ridge Environmental Learning Center. And it's a place where folks come and they learn about the natural world, and I got to share a lot of my photography with students there and really got hooked on the idea as images and using images as tools for conservation and for sharing stories with the public and to get folks to connect with animals and nature and some of the issues that our environment is facing globally through that storytelling. And so I'm really honored and excited to be part of this Document Spring project because we're going to be doing just that, and we're going to be taking an intimate look at our local environment here and looking at phenology, which is the study of the timing of nature's events. And so that can take many different forms, and what I'm going to focus here a little bit about is the photography aspect. And we're going to be looking at some things like camera settings and composition and just some simple techniques that you can all do to take better pictures. So as I was saying, you don't need a fancy, expensive camera to take great photos. There's lots of different ways, right? There's DSLR cameras like this one I use. I also always have my phone with me, and iPhones can take really good pictures. Any phone really. The cameras these days take really good photos. Even single-use film cameras, some folks still use. I know at Wolf Ridge there are still kids running around with the single-use cameras. And there's even ways to turn those digital. Once you have them printed out, you can even scan them and bring them in to the computer that way. So the phones, trail cameras, I'll talk a little bit more about that. There's some really neat ways that you can capture phenology events using like a game camera that you might have at home for maybe you're a hunter, maybe you use to scout, maybe you're just interested in what's in your backyard, but you can use these to see things that you wouldn't normally see in person, which is really fun. You can even use these trail cameras to do things like time lapses. Maybe you've got a fern that you want to watch unravel. You could set your camera up, and a lot of them have settings where you can even choose to have it take a picture every single minute for a few days. And then when you stitch those photos together in like a movie maker, you get this incredible video of it unraveling. And then of course there's point and shoot cameras. These are really popular as well. They're pretty easy to use, and they take great photos. Some of them are even waterproof, so you could even get phenology events underwater too. Where's my clicker? There we go. So this is just some of the equipment that I carry around. Like I said, you don't need to have big giant lenses to take cool photos. This is a 100 to 400 lens, and as you can see, it can expand. And this is a way that I can take close-up pictures of animals without stressing them out. So I don't need to get really close to them. But most cameras have a function or a way that you can zoom in and not be right on top of a critter. And we'll talk a little bit more about wildlife photography in a minute. As like a general walk-around lens, I have a 24 to 105 millimeter lens, and so I can take pictures from a wide-angle standpoint, mostly for like landscapes, whereas this zoom is more for like wildlife that are far away, or even taking close pictures of plants and stuff like that. I don't know if any of you have heard of like an extension tube, but this is a way that you can take shots or macro photography, close-up shots of things like insects. It just goes between the lens and the camera body, and these are pretty cheap. But if you have a point and shoot camera or a phone, usually the minimum focusing distance that you can take a picture of something is really close. So you can get great macro without a big zoom as well. Some of the things I also have are like a remote. If I don't want shake on the camera when I'm taking a picture of something that is stationary or small, I might use a tripod. I always have an extra set of batteries with me. I have one of these things to clean off the lens if there's dust on it. But really, your sleeve can do just fine as well, or like a microfiber cloth to just clean off the end of the lens. Maybe it's raining out, that kind of thing. The other thing is I always have extra memory cards with me when I go out there as well. All right, so we're going to dive a little bit into camera settings. Question?
I don't want to interrupt or change.
No problem.
You're going to maybe come back to this, but when you mentioned macro, that's
Yeah.
a really question we've talked a lot about. Is should we, the one lens we want to maybe get is a macro lens, so we can get some of that detail up close.
Yeah.
Did you just mention that might replace the macro, that little extension?
Oh, well, yeah, there are some lenses that are specifically meant for macro photography. Typical 100 millimeter is kind of a typical one that you might hear of. But yeah, this could actually turn a super telephoto lens into more like a microscope to take pictures sort of thing. So, yeah. So camera settings. We're going to look into aperture and depth of field. We're going to look at shutter speed, also ISO, and some of the different camera modes to control these settings. Now, they all sort of work together, and they work to get you an exposure, correct exposure of an image. And so what I mean by exposure is just the amount of light in different areas of your photograph. And how much light is it brighter or darker, that sort of thing. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is aperture range. And this is probably what I consider one of the most important settings when you're diving into it to drastically change the mood of your photo and that sort of thing. So the range of aperture that comes in what's called f-stops. And so it's numbers that usually range from on the low end, f2.8, to on the high end, f22. And it's sort of counterintuitive, but the way that you should remember this is aperture is like the camera's iris, so like your eyeball, right? So if the hole is larger, it's letting more light in, and so your photo will be brighter, right? And as that number goes higher to f22, that hole actually gets smaller. So larger the number, but smaller, smaller the iris is, the eye of your camera, okay? And what also goes with that is the depth of field. And so if you have a really large area f-stop, so a low number, f2.8, more light's coming in, but you're going to have a shallower depth of field. And this is going to make a little more sense when I show you some example photos. And when you have a larger number, it means that there's going to be less light and you might have a greater depth of field, and so more of your image is going to be exposed or is going to be in focus from front to back. So here are two images. On the left, I'm using a shallow depth of field technique. And so my number there, the aperture, is going to be a smaller number, f4, I believe, in this one. And so for the shallow depth of field photo, I wanted to take a picture of this cattail with ice crystals on it, and I wanted that to be the main thing that popped out, and so the background is blurred out. So a lower aperture like f4, it means that the subject that I'm photographing here is going to really pop, and the background is going to be blurred out. So the amount of sharpness in your photo from front to back with a lower number, it's going to really emphasize whatever you're focusing on and close to. On the right there, that is a sea cave up the North Shore. And we got the polar vortex this year, so it allowed some opportunities for photographers to get out on the ice, a place where you normally can't get to. And I was able to crawl into this cave and take this photo with the rising moon, so that's the full moon, and I was using a deep depth of field or large depth of field. And so for the sea cave, I wanted the entire image from front to back to be in focus and sharp. And so I focused here on this ice shard, and because I was using this higher number, means our iris is a smaller hole. It's going to be darker, but combined with something called a longer exposure, I could really get the inside and pull out some of those shadows from the sea cave and get the ice and get the moon and the moonlight coming in there as well. So that's why I chose the different apertures for these scenes. And so I found this wild bobcat roaming around my house, and I decided to do a little experiment to sort of illustrate aperture and how this works. And so I'm focusing on the nose of the bobcat here. And in this picture, I'm also focusing on the nose of the bobcat, but you'll notice that there's a difference in the background, right? So in the first one, we have a shallow depth of field. So I'm standing in the same exact spot for both of these photos, and I'm zooming in on the bobcat's nose, right? Focusing in the same exact spot, but because my aperture is different, the amount from front to back of the image that is in focus and sharp is different. So for the lower number, my subject really pops and the rest of the image is kind of blurred out, which gives it sort of a dreamy-like effect. If I wanted more of the image to be in focus, our subject might stand out a little less, but you can even start seeing things like the pattern on that vase, whereas it was blurred out with that aperture. So this next one is, higher number. So F22 is what I use to get all the succulent plants sharp, and you can actually see the pattern there too. So that's kind of the difference. These are my friends Shane and Emma. They got married a couple years ago, and they asked me to take some pictures for their wedding. And so one of the techniques that I tried was, well, why don't you clasp your hands and raise your hands out? And so their hands are coming closer to the camera. So I'm getting really close to their hands, and I'm focusing on their knuckles and their rings there to sort of emphasize that part of the picture. And you can see that their faces are a little blurred out and the scenery is a little blurred out, and that's to sort of give a point of interest to the photo. So that's a shallow depth of field because I'm focusing right there, and I'm using that low number there, that F4. And you can see the setting sun in the background, and the grass. It was a really beautiful hillside that we were on up there. And so shutter speed, and these all work together. So changing one can affect the other. Shutter speed. So we were talking about aperture, and you were thinking of that as basically the iris of the camera, and the larger it gets, the more light comes in, right? Now there's another way to control how bright or dark your image is, and that is shutter speed. And so you've got your iris that the light's coming through, and then imagine a door that flaps up and flaps down, and that's the shutter speed. So that also can allow light to pass through your iris, and however long that door stays up for, more light will come in, or if it's faster, less light will come in. And that also affects how your image turns out. So on the left, this is a photo up the Gunflint Trail north of Grand Marais, and I wanted a night photo with the Milky Way, and I wanted to be able to see exposed for the stars, and so I needed to let that light in for a longer period of time. So my shutter went up for 30 seconds, and that's something that you can control in your camera, the amount of time that door stays open or closed. Whereas on the right, there's a peregrine falcon that's diving at a bunch of biologists that are trying to ban some chicks on the North Shore, and she's coming really fast. They're the fastest birds on Earth, and they can go into a dive at over 200 miles an hour. And so to capture something like that, I need a very fast shutter, so it helps freeze motion. The faster your shutter speed is, you can capture images that are moving, subjects that are moving very fast. So if you were to imagine like a ceiling fan up there, if I was to use a low shutter speed, so something like 1/50th of a second instead of 1/4000th, my picture might turn out with that fan being blurred, right? It's all going to kind of look look blurred out. But then if I use something like 1/1000th or 1/2000th, that fan might be, even though it's moving really fast, you could see that the blades are frozen in the picture, to give you an example, which is why this bird is frozen in space. If I'd used a slower shutter speed, the wings might be completely blurred out, or it might just be a streak. You might not even be able to see that it was a bird flying towards the camera. So you can capture water and create this fluid-looking movement by also using a slower shutter speed. And so this is sort of a phenology event here. We've got the northern white cedar needles on the ground here. This is in the fall, and I wanted to have that blurred motion of the water to show movement. And so I used a slower shutter speed. So this was about 1 second. If you dip much below 1 second, it's going to really give things that are moving that fluid feel. And typically, you're using longer shutter speeds if you don't have a lot of light. So if it's early in the morning before the sun comes out, or if it's just after the sun sets, or if it's at night, like in my previous image, trying to get an exposure of the stars, I might choose to use a longer shutter speed. Yeah?
And if you're using a lower shutter speed, would you also have your camera on a tripod, or it's all going to
Yes.
blurred?
Yep, and so that's a good point. If I have a shutter speed that's going to be lower than about 1/50th of a second, even with something called image stabilization on the camera, which can help account for the shake of your hand, you might want a tripod if it's below, or if it's a longer shutter than that. So anything like 1/40th of a second, 1/30th of a second, or below, or longer than 1 second, 5 seconds, you'll want to have your camera on a tripod.
Is that the same breakpoint you would recommend for like a remote release too? Or?
Yeah, yep, I would. And what he means by remote release is having like a trigger on the camera where you're pressing the shutter without touching the camera. So it's a little remote there. And that can help eliminate any shake from when you press the button. Yeah?
I know you can't go over all the smartphones here, but a lot of what you're talking about here is some of that you see on a phone, some of it's after the fact, and I make the assumption that a lot of that's done digitally versus I'm not actually controlling the shutter, or I'm controlling exposure or aperture that's on here. Is that fairly true, or are there some phones, should I maybe look more at that, or are there some phones that actually can affect that on the front end?
Yeah, so a lot of the phones, they will, like you're saying, they'll be set to an automatic mode, and they're going to choose a lot of these different settings for you in order to create an exposure that the camera thinks is correct. Now, if you wanted to have a little bit more control, there are different apps that you can download, like a camera app, and a lot of them are free, that allow you to adjust specific things like aperture and shutter speed and ISO. So yeah, it's different for each camera, but there are free apps. And if you like, I can look at your phone with you after and see if we can find something. So, cool. So this photo, this woman, Angela, is on a train, and the background is blurred out. And so the shutter speed that I used was 1/50th of a second, which was enough to keep her head, she's laughing, right? So she's moving a little bit, but her face is sharp, but the background is blurred out because the scenery is passing by faster than she's moving. And so that kind of used that for that effect there. Chose that shutter speed on purpose. So ISO. ISO is basically how sensitive your sensor is. Think of your sensor as the brain to the camera, right? So your light passes through using aperture and shutter speed, but you can use ISO to also influence how bright or dark your photo is. And depending on what time of the day it is or how much light is available to you, you might want to choose different ISO numbers, or also pronounced ISO. And so a low ISO would be considered around 100. And a higher would be considered 3200 or 6400. Now some cameras go all the way up to 40,000 ISO, but you get kind of a trade-off, right? So if you use higher ISO numbers, you start getting a little bit more grain because the camera is trying to compensate for a lack of light. And so if we look at this scale, we can sort of see in these different situations, the they're standing there at the same time of day. The scenery is the exact same. The amount of sun is the same, but they're changing their ISO without changing any other settings. And so at ISO 100, it's a really dark image. And then if they ramp it up to 1600, so I'm guessing this is probably around when the sun's coming down and they want to photograph this rainbow, they have to increase their ISO in order to get a brighter image where you can really see what's going on in the whole photo. So higher numbers means your sensitive is more sensitive to light, allows you to use your camera in darker situations. It also allows you, so if I'm trying to photograph something like a snowy owl, which is a bird that might move fast, say it's perched, but at any point I want to be ready to capture its wings and get them frozen, then if it's getting close to dark, I might need to use a higher ISO in order for my shutter speed to be fast and allow the photo to be properly exposed. So here's another example. We have a low ISO number versus a high ISO number for the same photograph, and you can see a cleaner versus a more noisy image. So this is sort of that trade back that I was alluding to. It's great to use those higher ISO numbers so that you can have faster shutter speeds to make things sharp and freeze motion, but it also comes at a cost, which comes in the form of that noisy photo or some grain. So the camera modes. There's the automatic mode, and so in automatic mode, the camera is going to choose its best guess as to what all the settings should be in order to get a photo that you can really see what's going on in the image. The color and light is evenly distributed. Program mode, that allows you to manually set your ISO, so based on what your light conditions are outside, and it's going to choose your aperture and your shutter speed for you. A or AV mode, this is what I mostly shoot in. And so aperture priority means that I am manually setting what my aperture is. So that number, that F number, so f2.8 all the way up to f22, which influences the depth of field in a photo. I mostly shoot with that in a large variety of situations. Then there's F or TV mode, which is shutter priority mode. That allows you to manually choose your shutter speed. So an example might be that peregrine falcon. It's moving really fast. I know that for a flying bird, I want a shutter speed that's really fast. So I get to choose what that is. I know that 1/1000th of a second or faster is going to freeze any fast-moving bird. And so I might choose the TV mode and choose that fast shutter speed, and then the camera is going to decide what the aperture and what the ISO should be in order for that photo to be properly exposed. So if I had a really fast shutter speed and the camera wasn't adjusting those settings, it might mean that yes, the bird is frozen, but the photo's really dark. So this is a way to help properly expose the whole image while choosing your shutter speed. And then manual mode, that gives you complete control of all of the settings at once. And you have to have a really intimate knowledge of how all of these interact. And so I don't recommend going straight to manual mode when you're in a situation just starting out. Pretty much the only time I even use manual mode, and I've been doing this professionally for about 5 years, is that I only use that pretty much at night when I'm photographing something like the Northern Lights, or if I'm taking a picture like the one I showed you of the trees with the stars. That's when I might use manual mode, and I experiment quite a bit in order to figure out exactly how I want the image. So there's nothing wrong with automatic mode. A lot of we were talking about like different phones might be automatically set to that, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially when you're just trying to figure out how to take photos to start with. We will talk about some things like composition and other ways aside from settings that you can get really good photos, but yeah, there's nothing wrong with automatic. It's a good place to start, and it chooses all of these settings for you until you can get deeper understanding. But then once you do, it allows you to have more control over the situation. And so I was saying that the AV mode is what I use probably 95% of the time when I'm out there. I'm choosing that depth of field, I'm choosing that aperture, and that really can influence the photo quite a bit. So composition. Composition, basically how you compose your scene, what you see on the back of your viewfinder when you're looking through at a scene. And so some of the things that we're going to talk about is something called the rule of thirds, points of interest, where you're trying to direct your viewer's attention in an image, framing, how you can use things to really get the viewer to narrow in on your point of interest, leading lines, where you're directing the attention of your viewer into the scene, and also keeping it simple. So generally, the simpler an image, the more aesthetically pleasing it is. But at the same time, there should be no firm and set rule, and you should always be breaking rules, because then you can get some really creative pictures as well. But we'll go over sort of these general guidelines. So this is a photo that I took of a lake. This is right before sunrise, and so I got up and I was hoping that there'd be some fog on the lake, and we got some moving off from the trees over the water there, so I really liked that kind of ghostly feel of the image, and I used this tree here, this jack pine tree, to help frame the image, and this branch is a leading line. It helps frame the scene that we're looking at. I made sure to have plenty of the grass, this wavy grass with a nice light passing over it, in the foreground. Direct the attention inward to the scene, and then the line of the edge of the grass kind of allows you to look back into the scene that way, and it's sort of framing this little island of spruce out there. So we divide the image into thirds when we're thinking about the rule of thirds, and this gives roughly equal parts to the foreground, the water here, and also the sky. And so you generally want to have a balance of those things if you're thinking about a landscape. So this photo, for me, I thought it was a little too busy. So I was trying to do a little too much. There's a little too much going on in the scene. So you can sort of see the difference between these two. The branches are sort of intersecting on that horizon up there. We've got small seedling trees that are intersecting the water, and then you've got the sunset over here. There's a lot going on in this image. So for me, it's a little too busy. Try to keep your images simple. This is a common loon sitting on a nest. And so for this image, I'm using a really long telephoto lens. It's equivalent to about 1,000 millimeters. So I'm not super close to this bird, which is good because it's on a nest and it's a sensitive bird. So I want to make sure I'm keeping my distance. But in this photo, if we divide it into thirds, this is the other part of the rule of thirds. If we divide it in these planes here, where those lines intersect is where you should try to place your subject. And so I have the loon here, and I like to, for wildlife, I like to try to focus on the eye and make sure the eye is really sharp, because that's what we're drawn to as humans. We're drawn to the eye of the animal. And so I try to place that when I'm composing my image in that line where it's intersecting there, either in the top quadrant or the bottom third there. You can see that the nest and the body of the loon and the neck of the loon is all on the same vertical plane there. Also notice the direction that the loon is facing. So we'll talk about something called negative space in an image, and that just means everything, the area of space surrounding your subject. And so I like to compose images where the subject is looking into the negative space, because it draws the viewer's eye towards that animal, and then there's a direction to go to the rest of the image. So here's an example. This is of a flying peregrine falcon again. This is my first composition here, and these are different crops. So by cropping, I mean after you take an image, you can always, you can bring the dimensions of you can manipulate the dimensions of the photo to get different types of scenes. And so this flying peregrine falcon here, this is my first one. This is my second crop. And so now the animal is in the center of the photo, whereas here facing the outside. So the negative space in the photo is sort of behind the animal and it's looking the opposite direction. So as a viewer, when we take a look at this image, the first thing we see is the falcon, and then if we follow its direction, it goes right out of the frame really quickly. And in this image, it's sort of the same, maybe it's a little better, but still doesn't have much room to travel there for the viewer. And so my favorite is composition 3. It's generally the more favorable because there is space for this falcon to be flying into, and it does the movement of this fast animal justice because it gives us the space there. So generally composition 3. But like I said, you can always break the rules too, and sometimes really compelling images will break the rules. And so this is a male peregrine falcon that's flying right at me. And so generally, if you're trying to fill the frame of your image, you can break this rule, and sometimes it really works out quite nicely. Even though this animal is right in the middle of the frame and it's not on those intersecting lines, I think it still works really good.
Is that because of the leading lines, those branches going right to it?
Yeah, you can see some leading lines here, the branches focusing your attention towards the bird flying towards you. Yeah, and sort of framing it with the vegetation as well. I mentioned how I used that tree and the curved branch to frame the scene of that lake before. Similar sort of deal. So it directs your attention inward. So there are different compositions you can take. Most often you will take a picture horizontally, so just holding the camera like this. But you can also turn your camera vertically to get a completely different image of the same scene. And so this is a snowy owl at night. So this is up in Grand Marais. You can see the lighthouse in the background. And I was trying to take the image so that the owl was looking into that negative space there. And it's really dark. Almost all my light is gone. So my settings, just to give you an example, for most wildlife I use a low aperture, which gives me more light, but it also means that my subject stands out, whereas the background is blurred, that low aperture. Also using a higher ISO, because that also helps me get more light to the scene, and allows me to have faster shutter speeds, which will freeze any motion that the owl might make. If it's turning its head constantly, or if its wings come out, it'll freeze the motion there. So here's the same scene. I'm in the same exact spot. I just turned my camera like this to get a different feel. And I actually like this one a lot better personally. You can see more of that vertical structure of the lighthouse. And actually the owl is looking directly at me, whereas he was sort of glaring off into the distance there. But yeah, and so here's what my settings were for this photo to get you an idea of how all these settings work together. So in a low light situation, I was choosing this low aperture. I'm still fast enough that I can freeze any motion. Anything slower than this with a bird that could change directions suddenly is going to maybe produce some blur, which could also yield an interesting type of image. And then a higher ISO value. And so here's the same exact scene, but I just zoomed out. So the only difference between these photos is that I zoomed out a little bit to 300 millimeters, where this was more zoomed in. I like them both. They're very different images. So that's a technique that I like to try to spark some creativity. So when you're out there doing Document Spring, one of the things I challenge you to do is, without moving your feet, see how many different compositions you can get from the same scene. Maybe that means getting really low or turning the camera from horizontal to vertical, that sort of thing. So we're going to talk a little bit more about specifically photographing plants and animals. Plants are great because they don't run away from you. They're pretty much stationary, right? And you can find them just about anywhere. You can find compelling plants anywhere. And I really like ferns, and that's one of the ones we might look for on our phenology hikes out there. Because at this time of the year, they're starting to emerge out of the ground, and it's really neat to see them unravel and track them from day to day and week to week. So for macro photography, or for shooting something really close up, and you can get really close to plants, right, because they're not running away and they're not going to be offended by your presence, hopefully. And so you can get really close, and I encourage you to. So this shows a difference in trying different distances to your subject and different apertures. And so for this showy orchid, I got really close. I'm probably only a couple inches away from that flower. And you can see the background is blurred out. That's because I'm really close to my subject, closer than the distance between the background and the subject, and also because I'm using that low aperture, f4. Whereas the same two flowers, I zoomed out a little bit, got a little farther away, and I used a higher aperture, which allowed more of the scene around the photo, or around the subject, to be sharp from front to back. And I also encourage you, like I was saying, to experiment with different distances from your camera to the subject, but also with apertures, because that can give a very drastic different feel to the photo. And neither is right nor wrong. It's just your preference and how you experiment. So these are some bunchberries. I really like the contrast in colors that are in this one. I like playing with water, and so I'm out with my camera, even if it's a rainy day or it's drizzling out there. You can get the water droplets on the plants, can really add something to your photo, and have the different mosses there and the leaf litter. I'll add some contrast to that photo. And so for this one, I'm photographing straight down, so I'm pointing my camera straight down, and that allows me, combined with higher aperture number, to get all of the plants in focus at the same time. And so here are my settings here. So I'm using f10, 1/100th of a second, 95 millimeters, and ISO 800 because I'm underneath a canopy. So there's trees above me, which means there's less light coming in, and it's a rainy day, which means there's probably clouds up above me. So I needed to make my ISO higher in order to allow for more light, so I could take an image with a sort of fast shutter speed, because I'm hand holding my camera. I didn't have a tripod, at 1/100th of a second. Also, looking straight up is a good thing to practice too. So this is aspen trees in the fall, right when they get that golden color. And I'm just taking my wide angle lens and I'm focusing up, and I'm using leading lines. So I'm having those trunks follow the viewer's eyes central to that crown of the tree, the golden leaves there. And this is about an hour before the sun is setting, so the light from the sun is less harsh. The angle is such that it's backlighting these leaves so that they're really glowing. These are some horsetails, so I'm in a kayak, and I like to get on eye level with my subject. So that's another thing that you can try to drastically change and improve your compositions. And so I'm focusing on some of these horsetails nearest to me. I'm also using, let's see if I have my camera settings here. I'm using a shallow depth of field, so you can see a lot of the background is blurred. But I also noticed that the sunshine was bouncing off of the water and created these little spheres of light, which I really liked how it added to the photo. And so you can play with the light and play with how it interacts with the environment, and especially water. So puddles are a great thing as well to use in your photos. Reflections can be really neat. So this is a coral fungus. Once again, it's sort of a dark forest. There's a canopy above me, and I wanted to get this crazy fungus all in focus here. And so I needed to use a faster shutter speed, because once again, I didn't have my tripod. Turns out I forget it a lot. And so I'm holding it really close to the ground, and I used, to illuminate the coral, I just used the flashlight on my phone. So I turned that on because I didn't have a flash with me. So I just held this in one hand and then my camera in the other hand, and it allowed me to really illuminate that foreground of the photo. This is a scene at sunset. This is at that same wedding. And there's a monarch butterfly clinging to a flower up here, and there's the setting sun. Now I wanted to capture all the colors that were in the sky because it was beautiful pink and reds. And so in order to do that, I didn't want it to blow out the highlights, and I wanted the detail there. So I needed to use a faster shutter speed. And I was also concerned with that butterfly flying away, and so I wanted to freeze its motion if it flew. And so what I did there was I used a higher ISO value, and I used a flash. So that helped illuminate the foreground even though I was using a faster shutter speed. So the background of the image in the landscape is exposed, but I used a quick burst of flash just on an external flash that was mounted to the top of my camera. So photographing animals. One of the main things that we need to make note of right off the bat is that a lot of critters are nesting this time of year. And we want to be respectful of wildlife, especially nesting birds and things that might have young around that they're trying to feed and raise. And so this is a family of long-eared owls. And I'm using a really long lens, and I'm getting down at eye level, taking a few photos, and then I'm backing away. And the whole time that I'm taking this image, I'm watching the owl for any signs of distress. So if it starts panting a lot, or if it's making any noise, as soon as an animal appears stressed out, the first thing you want to do is just give it space and walk away. Can you see the animal in this photo? I bet you can now when it looks at you. And so animals have this incredible ability to camouflage, right? To blend in to their natural surroundings. So when we're out there and we're looking, you really have to pay attention to detail, because otherwise you might miss things. And that's something that photography has really helped me with, is to notice things that I didn't before. And so camouflage is one to look for. Also, when we're out on our nature hikes, we're going to do a little bit of wildlife tracking, because animals might be associated with phenology events as well. Some animals will hibernate out throughout the winter, and some will be active throughout the winter. But here we have some girdling happen. So this animal is feeding on the bark of this white pine. So something to notice. That clues me into, oh, there's an animal around that's eating the bark. We probably have an herbivore somewhere around here. And then I saw a pile of scat, or poo, right, at the base of this tree. And so that clued me to look up the tree. Now here's a different tree, and I see some scat coming out the bottom there, and there's a hollow opening in that tree, and there was something in there. You know, what it was so tracks. These are all things we can look for. Trails, like game trails. Scat territory markings. Sometimes you might see scratches on trees. You might see dens or burrows, holes in the ground. Those are all things to look for. This time of year, foxes will be excavating their dens, so that's a phenology event to look for. Chew marks or feeding, or even body parts. Some animals, like a deer, will actually shed their antlers every single year, and in the spring we can sometimes find them. They lose them around January, February. Or you could find hair from animals that are shedding and getting their spring coat. So those signs clued me into the porcupine, which I saw up in a maple tree. So trail cameras. This is a great technology that works for you when you're not around. So the way these work is with a passive infrared sensor that detects motion and heat energy. And so I was able to capture this photo at Wolf Ridge of a gray fox emerging from its burrow there. And what's great about it is that it's time-stamped. So for our phenology, it can really work well. So March 17th, 2014 is when the fox popped out of his den on that day. We can see when the beavers are active. This is them at their dam. There's a kit there, probably about a year-old kit. This is photography that I sort of specialize in, and it's like the little game cameras, but it takes nicer photos. So I'm using a DSLR camera like this, and I've built a homemade housing for it. So it's a Pelican waterproof case, which protects it from the elements and the weather. Has a photo glass filter there and a couple flashes. So, and there's the sensor up top. It's the same sensor that a trail camera uses. Flashes are there, sensors there, and the camera's there. And so I'm able to capture photos like this, because if I was there in person, I don't think this grouse would like if I was trying to get up in its business with a wide angle lens. And so I'm waiting on this drumming log. I saw that pile of scat, and I was able to capture this picture. Same log, there's a raccoon coming. I like how he's facing the negative space. He's crawling into the image. Here's a killdeer. This is a remote camera on the ground. There's its nest there. They're really camouflaged really well. They like gravel pits and open area, gravelly areas where they can hide their nests and see predators that are coming. This is a remotely triggered camera, so I actually have a remote, and I'm sitting a couple hundred yards away, pressing the shutter when I see the fox come out. And they were actually really curious. They actually were interacting with the camera and like tipped it over and stuff. So, and then I had to wait until they went back in their den to retrieve it. So I was able to capture a photo like this. So something to look for in terms of like burrows. You might even see things like discarded prey items, bones outside of the den. This is an ermine. This is some deer meat from a roadkill. Took it into the woods and put a camera on it, and you can see what scavengers show up. So this is an ermine, and then about a week later, you see a change start to happen. There's a black stripe that's coming down the length, and that brown, or black and brown, and that will encapsulate the fur of that animal, the pelage of that animal, and it helps it blend in different times of the year. And so that's a phenology event to look for as well. Another one is the snowshoe hare. They're really white in the winter to blend in with the snow, but this time of year they're starting to turn brown. So that's a phenology event to look for as well. Another one is underwater photography. Now this is a fellow by the name of Jason Ching, and he was able to photograph the migration of northern pike, which we have up here. He's actually in Alaska, but you can look for phenology events underwater as well, fish migrations and when they're building their nests and laying their eggs. And he's got a camera way over there photographing these salmon, and he's got a trigger in his hand there. So yeah, those northern pike, they migrate up to those shallower wetlands as a spawning area in the spring. So yeah, we covered a lot of ground, but like I said, we can start with the automatic modes, and then when you're ready for a little bit more control of your image, you can try experimenting with things like ISO and aperture and shutter speed. We talked about composition and framing and getting low, getting at eye subject or eye level with your subject, looking for leading lines and simplicity. But the most important thing to remember is to have fun with it and to experiment. You shouldn't take any of these rules as really rigid. Be willing to break any of the guidelines and try new things, and to really just take a lot of photos and find what style works for you. So thank you all very much. I'll be around if anyone has any questions. We also have some other professional photographers in the room that might help me with your questions. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks. I also have an email here if you would rather type me a question, that sort of thing. I have cards if you want to get in contact with me that way.